It was one of the greatest debut albums of all time by a monster rock band that by my account is really the most underappreciated band of the rock and roll era. He should have been in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a long time ago. The story of a couple of key songs from the album by a man who was there. I can't miss episode next on Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. If music is part of the joy of your life, you're going to want to subscribe below right now so you never miss an episode of our daily features, stories straight from the artists. Make sure to check us out on Patreon as well to become an insider with us. Now it's time for another episode of our series Revelations, where featured artists reveal rare stories about their greatest songs and albums. On this installment of Revelations, we have original Boston drummer James Masdea, who was with Tom Scholz in the basement for over 5 years as Boston's self-titled debut album came together. Masdea was given an arrangement credit on the album. Here Jim tells us about those years of tireless effort and the genius of Tom Scholz and Brad Delp and the band, as well as the creation of this classic rock masterpiece with Foreplay and Long Time. It's been such a long time. For many years, Boston's self-titled album was the biggest selling debut album ever until Guns N' Roses passed it up a short time ago. Now, as we go into this interview, I want to thank our sponsor, Zenni Eyewear, the brand I always wear. When you go to Zenni.com, you can do a virtual try-on, where you can see exactly how the eyewear is going to look on you and make sure it matches your face with Zenni's virtual mirror feature. Check it out today at Zenni.com. Here's Jim with the story. I'm proud to recognize the historic contributions of Mr. James Masdea. Jim, thank you so much for being a part of this Revelations with Professor of Rock. We really appreciate it. We're really excited. You're part of one of the most interesting basement to penthouse stories in all of music history. But let's go back to your humble beginnings. You grew up in a neighborhood in Jamaica Plain, which was part of Boston's inner city.
Correct. It was actually right along the New Haven rail line, and it was in the red-lined area. It was a big controversy back then. We had my parents had bought an old Victorian, and even in the 70s, we could only get $10,000 for it because it had been redlined. You couldn't get mortgages. The house was a beautiful old Victorian. That's where I came from. I mean, it was a cool neighborhood to grow up. It was definitely the inner city.
Well, around 1970, when you responded to an advertisement from a band that included Tom Scholz and really connected with Tom and developed a really close relationship with him, what was it that made you two click?
After I had auditioned for the band, it was actually 69. It was the summer of 69. A week went by and I got a call back. It was from Tom, and they asked me to join. So on the first rehearsal, when I got back, brought my drums over, we were practicing on Meb Drive at MIT, one of the frat houses. So I brought my stuff up, set up, and we were about to start the first rehearsal. And Tom said, you know, Jim, we auditioned a lot of drummers. We had guys from Berkeley, and many guys were trained, practiced, rudimental drummers. They'd studied for years. He goes, basically, they were all better than you. And I'm like, well, thanks a lot. But he goes, when we just jammed, they couldn't touch you. And that reason is because I taught myself to play. All those other, the guy from Berkeley played a drum solo from some prominent album at that time.
Buddy Rich at the drums, ladies and gentlemen.
Perfect, hit for hit, perfect. But when it came to playing, I've always just created in real time. I'm not trying to play something I played yesterday. I just play and this flows. So when we jammed, I'm always listening to the other players and interacting and reinforcing what they're doing, like say Brad's vocal phrasing. Tom's solos. I work with it to improve, to bring you more out of it. So that was my difference from all the other drummers. Tom wanted to write original tunes. So Tom, after we did that initial band and they brought me in, We did it for a few months, then it broke up. Tom and I agreed he was going to bring his gear to my home, and we would continue working on the originals. That was the November '69. And I remember when Tom first moved the stuff over, he built a little security system. A little, like kind of a little something. He built a little light setting for us, but then he built this little security to protect the equipment because it was over in my neighborhood, Jamaica Plains ghetto, you know. So, I mean, Tom, he bought a Silvertone amp back then. It was a Silvertone had a guitar amp. So he had a Silvertone amp, then he had an M1 organ that he had cut in half and rewired so we could make it easier to move, right? It was cool. So he brought his organ, his Leslie, the Silvertone, and he had a red Yamaha electric acoustic. We used to kid him about that, going, "Hey man, you got to jump start that, or was it got the electric start?" So he brought all that stuff to my house. For 5 years, almost once to twice a week, we developed all the first 2 albums. During that time, it was probably maybe 4, 5, 6 months. It was just Tom and I working on ideas. The first song, Boston song I ever recorded was Foreplay in my basement. Tom and I, and Tom had brought a little Sony over and recorded it. That was the first thing I ever recorded. We basically developed a bunch of tunes, and then we went into a place called Natural Sound. It's in Maynard, Mass. It's a studio, and we did our first demo. So that was sometime in '70. I don't know if it was early, late '70. Then once we did the first session, we did that demo. Then we decided we was trying to do a cover band, not a cover, but do a band. And Barry came back. We had a different singer and different bass player. So that was the beginning of the band.
Then in '74, Tom used more of his personal income that he'd made from Polaroid to finance another round of demo recordings.
Shoot a pack of instant pictures today.
And started building the studio in his basement.
Well, we didn't start right away. After '70, when we did the first demo, we did, for about a year, we did a couple other tries in real studios. I remember we were in Jamaica Plains, a nice studio. We go in, start the session. Tom pulls out a wild flutter meter. And the engineer was like, "What the f is that?" I had no clue. They never made the machines run right. The wild flutter was so bad. Tom ran that thing like a Mercedes. He got this up. But the guy was like, "Whoa." So Tom was checking his machine, saying, "Oh, man, this machine's..." So he realized at that point that he's wasting money, and he knows more than these guys anyway. So he decided to make his own 4-track. He had a old Roberts reversing stereo reel-to-reel. It had moving heads. It had 4 heads where it would shift. He took that, and he took a little Sony, and he opened that up, and he wired in a little patch field, and he could get into each of the channels of that 4-track. And that was how we started doing all the demos. So Tom and I, right from the beginning, it was an intimate relationship. He relied on my percussive foundation. He's a phenomenal keyboard player. I laid a nice feel, and he searched. We worked together. We interacted. We encouraged each other. If I like that, I'd let him know. If he thought I should do this different. And that's how all the songs were developed, us back and forth, because Tom played everything.
Well, what songs were on that first demo tape that you made with Tom? Do you remember?
Yeah, the main song that's significant is Hitch a Ride. It was San Francisco Day at the time. And of all the songs on the album, that was the only one that had really developed more maturity, because we're new at it, but it stood out. And there was Queen of Hearts. There was a few different songs. Basically, it's the songs. It's in different levels of development. But that one song, when we sent out the demo, every record label wanted to buy that tune. They didn't want to sign us because the rest of the stuff was not ready. But they all wanted to buy that tune. But Tom kept going. And that song, even till this day, when you listen to that song on the album, that song takes you back to my basement. It takes you back to the true roots of Boston. That's how we sounded. Before all the technology and everything that came along. So when you hear that, we're not the greatest players, but the energy and the feel and everything about it is amazing. And then that ending is classic. Halfway through the song, we start this long ending. It's really cool. Like, it ends and then it starts. And Tom had developed a device to give him multiple EQ curves. So it was the first time that anyone had really done such a thing with his solo, so that 5 different parts of that solo had different EQ curves. So they had different sound and impact. One of my favorite songs.
You mentioned Foreplay. Let's talk about Foreplay. While attending MIT, Tom created Foreplay, of course, an instrumental, and it was the first piece of music that Scholes composed.
It's probably one of the first ones, yeah. The first rehearsal in MIT, Tom already had that little lick, and then we started working on it. Beginning in '69, it was hard work. We spent 5 years in my basement. And then we developed a system after we had rehearsed and worked the song for who knows how long, and we were happy. I would move my kit to his house in Watertown, and we'd set up, mic it up, get the sound. And then we would spend all day on one song that we were going to work on. And I would do 1,000 takes. Tom recorded everything. The next week, he would review it all, go all through it. I'd come back the following week again, and then he'd play the stuff he liked best. Then I'd listen to that, and then I adapted and created the final drum bit. And then he then put everything on. You know, it's then bass, guitar, it's all time. That system, we did that for years, and that's how we kept developing. So at each stage, and then we just keep going more and more.
Well, with Foreplay, was it originally presented to you as something that you wanted to have it arranged as like this dramatic rock symphony that we hear? Because it's very prog rock as well.
No, but it was just what he did.
What I love about Boston is Foreplay, when it first starts, and then all of a sudden, you start going into long time. Prog rock, and then going into the kind of the classic rock elements that make all classic rock great.
What you're describing, this is some of Tom's genius. Tom is an engineer. He's a designer. So all those subtle little things, it's Tom. It's no one else but Tom. Because that's his expertise. People always try to figure out how people write songs. Some people make believe that I just sit down and I compose this piece. No. It's noodling. Any good musician, you sit in the living room, you watch the TV, and you're just noodling. You're just making your fingers go. You're just doing that. And over time, you end up, you end up with a piece, a part of a song. And then you figure something to go along with it. It's over time. It's interesting. You talked about Tom's equipment. I think all of the Rockman gear was inspired by, after Tom bought that Silvertone, first year, I remember he cut a hole in the side of the amp head, installed a 4 or 5 inch speaker, and then he got a big rheostat, and he could sit in the living room, and he could crank it up to get sustain, and he just dropped the speaker, and he could noodle. And that, I think, is the beginning of the Rockman, because the next step was the power soak. So that rheostat, he got to do that. He then turned around and packaged it into a box, and he made it the power soak. Then the next step was a network, a resistor network. And I actually, with him in his shop, we built the breadboard for that. I put together, he designed the circuit and grabbed it, and I built the thing on the breadboard. And then that came out as the box it was positioned so you could get different levels. Then the Rockman finally, years later, was developed. But that, I think, was the inspiration was noodling, sitting with your wife in the living room watching TV. And then I don't know if he really knew he was going to get the sound, but by doing that, he allowed himself to crank the amp, saturate the tubes, but have the volume low and have incredible sustain. So I don't know if he was planning that or it just happened from noodling,
Foreplay is this breathtaking orchestral track that segues into Long Time. And then it goes into that classic rock sound that we know as classic rock now. They weren't calling it that then. But the second single from the album, what do you remember about arranging the two songs together to segue with him? There's the organ and the acoustic guitar, the hand claps.
A lot of what happened in these songs is that when we were playing live, we started doing segues. So as we're trying to make the performances as a cover band, not even the originals yet, but just whenever we started playing. So a part of that came from that aspect of trying to segue. So all of a sudden, this segue, and even in the tours now, you'll still hear him. He's been doing it 30, 40 years. Some of the same segue to go to different songs. So I'm sure part of that with Long Time and Foreplay was a matter of trying to do some kind of segue. And then, wait a minute, Foreplay kind of, and then into Long Time. Whether or not he really had thought of it as that, it couldn't have been, because again, he only had that. In 69, that's all he had. He didn't play that and then go into a long time didn't exist yet. So, so he basically utilized Foreplay just as a segue, probably from something else, then into Long Time, and then it became what it is.
That is such a classic Boston sound. Acoustic guitar, then it turns into the harmony guitars and Brad's amazing vocal. What do you remember about when you were starting to record that?
This is a long process. You don't sit down and play it and it's done. So it's a year. It's years, between when I put the bed down to where he might finally have everything else finished.
When you get to that hand claps and then that first chorus, what I like about it is you have the first chorus, and then you have the face melter after the second chorus of the guitar. And then that Brad Delp scream. Just incredible. Were you in the studio when they were finishing the last?
No, my work is first, the drum beds. Tom was very, quiet. He did all his work by himself. When Brad came, it was just him and Brad. I didn't really take part in those. So I really couldn't tell you exactly. But I've been in the studio with Brad at other times. Some of this, I just wasn't all the time. That specific song, I don't remember. But Brad, again, he's just a phenomenal genius. Everything that came out of his mouth was great.
It's a different song without those hand claps.
If anything, because the hand claps are a little out of time. They're not perfect. That song, greatness comes from flaws, not from perfection. So in the studio, actually we used some paint cans or coffee cans. It wasn't, it was kind of just like hey, let's try this. And it worked. So, it wasn't percussion instruments. It wasn't even musicians. I think it was some friends of Cindy, Tom's wife or something, but it was just, I think Cindy was in there. So it wasn't musicians. And that's it. That's part of the genius. That's part of the genius, because it made it not perfect. I used to hate it a little bit because I'm listening to them. They're going, man, I can listen to them. We were a band. We were a working band. We were constantly developing. We were practicing all the time. New ideas were always coming up. So it was an ongoing process. The thing about Long Time is Brad's scat singing in the end. Brad's voice is one in its own. It's the greatest voice in rock and music, I think. It's just the quality from his lowest note to his highest, the fullness, the quality. It's just incredible.
What did you think the first time that you heard Brad sing?
There's no way to describe it. I mean, again, every vocal on that album is Brad, and he just spit them out. No one can do that. There's no one on the planet. I look at Brad, Steve Perry. They're the two cream as far as the quality. They're not showing about attitude and punk or all that. But the beauty of their voices, you can't touch them. I've never, standing on stage when Brad goes and hits that high note in More Than a Feeling. And he does it, he's already singing a note higher than any human, and then he goes higher. I've never seen anything like that anywhere.
Yeah, you're right. To me, Brad Delp and Steve Perry, I think that's the bar. The bar has been set for male singing.
From a standpoint of quality, not about entertaining.
How would you best describe the genius of Tom, his invention, and then just him as a player, as a producer and songwriter?
I can remember the first times we started playing, we jammed. After we rehearsed the cover band, we would jam. And I can still, to this day, see him sitting right there at his M, and he would be doing, because he had the M, he had the double keyboard. So he could get these nice, fast kind of runs on the keys, and we were interacting, and it was phenomenal. And then once he got going on guitar, and we'd be doing the double solos, and again, still, he was a strong player. Tom is an engineer, he is a genius, and he built this over years and is the main one. So it's, and all that stuff, it's him.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Leave us a comment about Boston, one of the greatest bands ever, their debut album, and these classic songs. If you like our videos, we do invite you to subscribe below to be a part of our community. To get this Boston shirt or any of their albums, click on our Amazon links below. And to get even more content and become an insider with this insider access, join us on Patreon. Help us keep the music alive. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends. Stay safe out there.